We began this lengthy excursion into the study of perception by asking how we are hooked into the world via the senses. That provides a very broad field of inquiry, and we distinguish two main frameworks within which such thoughts can be developed. There is an internalist or representational approach, grounded in the computational theory of mind, which focuses on what's going on inside the head. And there are relational approaches, which focus instead on patterns of activity in the world and how the organism is related to the world. Now, most of the work in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience has been done squarely within the representationalist tradition. Such work as Hubel and Wiesel and David Marr, and of course Milner and Goodale's dual visual processing streams. But we noted that such approaches have their limitations. We have more questions. And we noted, for example, one thing that such approaches are not well positioned to recognize is the fundamental role that change plays in perceiving. Change and activity became central concerns in the last video. What we're going to do now is just look at the case of the movement of the eyes. So we're looking at the role of change in vision. And we're going to identify many kinds of eye movements. The eyes are constantly in motion. And I come back to the point that this, for a camera, would be a problem, but for the eye, is the condition of operation, is the basis for seeing. Now, there are many kinds of eye movements. The ones you're most familiar with, and you probably think of when I say eye movements, are saccades. These involve shift, a voluntary shift, in the direction of gaze, focus on one point, and then focus on another point. In the top right of the slide there, you can see an image of a face. This was viewed by somebody in a device known as an eye tracker, which records the direction of gaze. And there on the right-hand side, you can see the eye track. And each dot there represents a particular focus of gaze, and the lines connecting the dots represent saccades. And this pattern for observing a face reveals a form of inquiry. Notice how the saccades are bouncing around between the eyes and the mouth, the most salient features of a face. Saccades are well known to us and have been studied greatly, but there are many other kinds of eye movements. Nystagmus refers to a complex set of movements. The term is often used to describe particular kinds of pathology, but we're not dealing here with pathology, we're dealing here with physiology. And here the word nystagmus refers to the way in which moving things in your field will sort of drag the eye with them. If something moves across your field of vision, you can follow it smoothly with your eyes. So that's a form of movement called smooth pursuit movement. And when the thing goes away, your eyes will jump back. This happens all the time. If there's a lot of things around you, your eyeballs are being tugged and pulled in various ways. It's also a curious fact that smooth pursuit movement is something we can only do when there is an appropriate relation to the world. Now, if I hold out my finger and use my eyeballs to track it, if I follow it, I can smoothly follow the finger motion without a problem. If I take the finger away and I try to move my eyes in the same way, I literally cannot do it. My eyes will jump. I can saccade, but in order for smooth pursuit movement to work, the world must do its part. So we'll look a bit more at that in a minute. There are other forms of movement whose role, functional or otherwise, in vision is not well understood. When you saccade to a particular point, the eyeball starts to drift away, and there are microsaccades that bring you back, that correct, as it were, this built-in drift. And then there's something we know very little about, which is the eyeball vibrates at about 80 times a second. It has an intrinsic physiological tremor. So you can see there's all kinds of processes of change going on in vision. And motion is not a problem to be overcome. This is how the visual system works. So when we pay attention to these, we realize the analogy between the eye and the camera is grossly misleading. Now, here we're going to look at two specific kinds of change as they relate to vision. And we're going to notice that a representational internalist framework will describe them in one way, and a relational framework will describe them in another way. The contrast is quite stark. In an internalist approach, we will identify two different mechanisms, supported by two different sets of processes and even muscles. So there's clearly two different mechanisms. From a relational point of view, we'll see that they come back to being the same phenomenon. And we might be reminded here of David Marr's useful distinction between a computational and an algorithmic approach. In this case, and in this case only, the relational approach that sees these as one thing will be essentially providing a computational description. It'll be a description of a single phenomenon, where the internalist approach will split apart two separate mechanisms, which are different means of algorithmic implementation of the same computational phenomenon. So, we start with smooth pursuit movement. This guy is following the finger and the eyes can move smoothly. This ensures that the thing being looked at, in this case the tip of my finger, projects back towards the fovea, where distinctions are drawn most clearly. And it cannot be done without the presence of the target. This is an important point. So this is fundamentally about a relationship between a viewer and the thing being viewed. Now, we know an awful lot about the mechanisms underlying this, and you would look for means of stabilizing the eyeball with respect to something in the world. Here's a different mechanism called the vestibular ocular reflex, and this is crucially part of the visual system that necessarily involves the vestibular system, that is, those accelerometers inside the ear that keep track of head acceleration and balance. This reflex, the so-called vestibular ocular reflex, compensates for movement of the head as you keep the position of gaze focused in one direction, much like the way a Steadicam operates. This poor woman is having her head yanked around and she's staring at a fixed point. So as the head moves, the relationship of the eyes to the thing being viewed remain the same. Now, notice what's going on here. In each case, at one level, there's a constant, an invariant, and that is the relationship between the viewing subject and the thing being viewed. In the case of smooth pursuit movement, change arises in the position of the thing being viewed, and the smooth pursuit movement serves to stabilize the relationship between the viewing subject and the thing viewed. In the case of the vestibular ocular reflex, the change is of a different origin. This is egocentric change. It arises from motion of the head, and yet the relationship that is maintained, the same invariant is maintained. So we've got two mechanisms and one relationship. Incidentally, the vestibular ocular reflex is very complicated, but is quite well understood as a mechanism, and it involves very complex control of the muscles in which the eyeballs are cradled. Now, human vision and mammalian vision generally makes use of this, but not all animals have it. And birds in particular need to solve the same problem, but they are differently constituted. And this task is distributed over the head and neck, using the head and neck muscles instead of the eyeball muscles. And that looks kind of weird. If you keep your eye on this very virtuous and long-suffering owl here, you'll see that the direction of gaze remains absolutely constant despite the indignities to which the owl is being exposed. Vestibular ocular reflex can be great fun to study. For a bird, of course, maintaining a reliable relationship between the bird and the world is of the greatest importance, and this must work at high speeds with very little time. So, smooth pursuit tracking identifies a function which is following something in the world. Vestibular ocular reflex identifies an internal mechanism. So from a mechanistic point of view, and from a point of view in which we place perception inside the head of the subject, they look quite separate, and they are supported by separate mechanisms, and we can identify those mechanisms. And yet that story misses something, which is that both of these serve to maintain a single invariant, which is the relationship between the organism and the world. They are flip sides of the same coin, as it were. And here you see many of the paradoxes that we encounter as we study perception. There's always more than one way to look at it.